and that's what everyone wants. Thursday. I call the Minister for Environment and Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And the Labor Party must think that offence is the best form of defence, Mr. Speaker, because they must have written this MPI for us, because we're happy to talk about energy policy. We're happy to talk about the legacy that we inherited from the Labor Party and our plans for getting it right, because Australians deserve better energy outcomes than the Labor Party ever delivered for them. During the time that we had the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd years, we had electricity prices increased by more than 100%. There were some 12 different policies. My colleagues may remember the cash for clunkers, the Citizens' Assembly, whether it's a CPRS, an ETS or indeed the carbon tax, a $15 billion hit on households, Mr. Speaker. That was the legacy of the Labor Party when they were in office. And of course we've seen this headlong pursuit of 50% renewable energy targets by Labor governments, including the great big experiment gone wrong in South Australia under Jay Weatherall's leadership. Now, what we've seen from the Labor Party there is denying that there has been a problem, until for the first time ever 1.7 million people across a whole state lost their power in South Australia. This was devastating, devastating for households, devastating for business confidence and devastating for those high energy users like Nearstar and their Port Pirie smelter, like BHP at Olympic Dam, like Ariam at Whyalla, and obviously they're trying to sell that asset. This couldn't have come at a worse time, Mr. Speaker. That is what happens when you put ideology ahead of practical policies focused on energy security and energy affordability. And then we turn to Victoria, where the Andrews government had a minister who described the continued operation of Hazelwood as disgraceful. No wonder then that the Andrews Labor government tripled the coal royalties on those operating in the Latrobe Valley, putting extra pressure on the balance sheet of the owners of Hazelwood, namely Engie and Mitsui, Mr. Speaker. And of course they pursued a 40% renewable energy target, which again made it more difficult for the thermal generators in that space. And then those mad moratoriums on conventional and unconventional gas extraction in Victoria. To think that Geosciences Australia tell us that Victoria has some 40 years worth of reserves, in the Northern Territory maybe up to 180 years worth of reserves, and of course in other parts of the country. But governments have been putting in place these moratoriums on the conventional and unconventional gas extraction. Mr. Speaker, that is the legacy that we inherited. That is the legacy that we inherited and the wrongs that we are now trying to get right. And what we are doing is we're pursuing important reforms through the COAG Energy Council, particularly to get lower prices for the transportation of gas, some historic reforms, the most significant in some 2 decades, and with bringing the pipeline operators together with their customers and to avoid the unequal bargaining situation, Mr. Speaker. With the meeting that the Prime Minister called with the LNG suppliers, focused on getting more gas out of the ground and more gas into the domestic market by getting a commitment from those big players that they will meet future shortfalls in the domestic market. This was critical because we had heard from the Australian Energy Market Operator that there would be shortfalls ranging from 10 to 54 petajoules from the summer of 2018-19, hitting the states of Victoria, South Australia, New South Wales and later on Queensland, Mr. Speaker. They're practical results. We're now reining in the network costs that make up to 50% of a household bill by getting a significant agreement through the COAG Energy Council to prevent the limited merits review process operating in the scope and the scale that it has to date, Mr. Speaker. And of course, the record investments in storage through the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, ARENA, Kidston in Queensland, Coltana in South Australia, Snowy Hydro 2.0, which has the potential to boost the output from the Snowy scheme by some 50%, 2,000 megawatts, Mr. Speaker, creating more than 500 jobs, powering 500,000 homes using renewable energy power and pump storage, Mr. Speaker. Absolutely critical for the future stability of our grid, Mr. Speaker. interrupt to say, how do you get it up the hill? Well, this is like 3 projects that we currently have in Australia with pumped hydro. You have a reservoir up the top, a reservoir down the dome, and you pump it up, Mr. Speaker, when the power is cheap, and you send it down. You send it down the hill to create the power when you need it most. So it's important to meet the peak demand, Mr. Speaker. And of course, we have commissioned the Finkel Review. The Finkel Review, commissioned by COAG to look at energy security, getting our chief scientist an independent panel, and we look forward to seeing their recommendations, Mr. Speaker. They're all the positive reforms that we now have underway to get energy security, energy affordability as we transition to a lower emissions future. And it's worth pointing out to those opposite that we not only met our first Kyoto target, but we're on track to beat our 2020 target by some 224 million tonnes. And we've halved the ask over the last year as to what we need to do to meet our 2030 targets. So we're absolutely serious about meeting our emissions reduction targets, and we do that through the National Energy Productivity Plan, through the Emissions Reduction Fund, through the 23.5% RED, through a whole range of processes. But we will not compromise energy security and affordability. We will not, at a federal level, see the big mistake of Jay Weatherall repeated writ large, Mr. Speaker. Now, those opposite have a quadrilla of disastrous energy policies. First and foremost, they have their 50% RED, and depending on the day, they say it will be legislated or it won't be legislated. Depending on the day, they'll say it will cost $48 billion or it will cost nothing, Mr. Speaker. Depending on the day, it will be an ambition. It might be a goal, it might be an objective, it might be a task. Who knows what it might be? It depends on who you ask opposite. But what we do know is they have a 50% renewable energy target locked into the election commitment that they took to the last election. They also have a 45% emission reduction target. Now, why is that important? Because it's nearly double what we have at 26 to 28%, and we know there's no hope in hell that you're going to meet your 45% emissions target. And the member for Port Adelaide, who has this wry smile on his face, he knows what's coming next. He knows what's coming next, and that is he talks about an emissions intensity scheme, and he talks about the Australian Energy Market Commission's modelling for an emissions intensity scheme, but he fails to tell you that that was modelled on a 26 to 28% target, not the 45% target. We would love to see the numbers. We'd love to see the numbers of what it would produce with a 45% target. We'd love to see how much it's going to cost the Australian economy to get to a 45% emissions target by 2030, which is your policy. No wonder, Mr. Speaker, no wonder that we on this side of the House are pointing to the words of the BCA, who said that it's risky, who said that their policy is risky and could jeopardise future economic growth. That's what we hear from the BCA about Labor's 45% emissions target. And we haven't even finished on their quadrilla policy. Now, I mentioned the emissions intensity scheme, that's the third one. And what about their forced closure of coal-fired power plants, Mr. Speaker? We can't afford to lose that baseload power, which provides the frequency control and ancillary services, the inertia that you need, that you get from coal, that you get from gas, that you get from hydro, that you don't get from intermittent sources of power like wind and solar, Mr. Speaker. That's why people like AEMO, the AMC, have been warning about this rise of intermittent power and the impacts it would have on the stability of the grid if you don't plan, if you don't prepare, which is what we actually saw play out in South Australia, Mr. Speaker. So they have a plan to close coal-fired power stations like your lawn in Victoria. They want to close your lawn. Not only close Hazelwood, which the member for Port Adelaide talked about kick-starting the closure of coal-fired power stations, they want to close your lawn. They want to close Hazelwood. They want to close Muja A and B, Mr. Speaker. They want to close Vales Point. Vales Point in the member for Shortlands electorate. They want to close that, Mr. Speaker. A whole series of coal-fired power stations want to close. And who did they partner with? Who did the Labor Party partner with in the Senate to pass a motion for the closure of coal-fired power stations? The Greens, Mr. Speaker. The Greens. So you want to outgreen the Greens. That's what the real fixer, Graham Richardson, said. You can't outgreen the Greens, but that's what the Labor Party wants to do, Mr. Speaker. So it's become embarrassing. It's become embarrassing, and now it's becoming dangerous. It's becoming embarrassing, and now it's becoming dangerous because the Labor Party and the member for Port Adelaide is leading this charge. He wants to win Green votes in the city. He wants to win Green votes in the city, and in the process, sell out the blue-collar jobs in the regions, Mr Speaker. We won't do that. We'll promote energy affordability, energy security as we transition to a low-emissions future.
Before I call the member for Eden Monaro, I will remind the member for Chifley that he's much louder sitting there than he was up the other end, and he is warned.